Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Development Discourse, where we ideate for Africa's development. My name is Patrick Okigbo, founding partner at Nextier. Nextier is a multi-competency advisory firm that's focused on solving Africa's complex development challenges. Nigeria's security landscape is increasingly fragile, with various violent conflicts, converging to threaten national stability. I mean, these challenges strain security forces, they exacerbate socioeconomic hardships and erode public trust in governance. Without urgent and sustained interventions, Nigeria risks escalating instability and worsening economic conditions. My guest today will help us chart a path to peace. Professor Darren Kew is the Dean of the Kroc School of Peace Studies at University of San Diego. He studies the relationship between conflict resolution methods, particularly interfaith and inter-ethnic peace building and democratic development in Africa, Northern Ireland, and the United States. Much of his work focuses on the role of civil society groups. He has consulted on peace and democracy initiatives for the United Nations, USAID, U.S. Institute of Peace, the U.S. State Department, and several non-governmental organizations, including the Carter Center. Darren is well known to us in Nigeria. He's monitored the last 7 Nigerian elections and the 2007 elections in Sierra Leone. In 2023 to 24, he co-facilitated a working group of religious leaders focusing on religion and peace building in Belfast, Northern Ireland. He's the author of numerous works on Nigerian politics and conflict resolution, including Civil Society, Conflict Resolution, and Democracy in Nigeria, and his articles have appeared in several prestigious journals. Darren, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that very kind introduction. It's good to see you.
Same. I mean, if we go back to, say, 2009, right, at the very start of Boko Haram, it seemed like a very fringe distraction that Nigeria's military could very easily contain. A decade and a half later, it has morphed into different kinds of conflict that covers, every facet of Nigeria. From your studies, how do you understand these violent conflicts in Nigeria? What are, in your view, the root causes and some of the key drivers of these seemingly intractable challenges we face?
Thank you for that. I think there's a number of different root drivers that we could talk about. Let's start with the one, of course, that I think many Nigerians themselves like to begin the conversation with, which is the imposed nature of the Nigerian state. It's not an organic state. As we know, right? It's an imposition of colonialism, and it lumped together many different nations and peoples who prior to that point had been independent and had been following separate paths, and then essentially forced Nigerians to do what the European Union has been trying to do for decades, to try to forge a single identity politically out of many different identities, except Nigerians have been doing it without the deep institutional supports or the economic riches that the Europeans enjoy. And so I think that sort of deep diversity across Nigeria is often a difficulty, at least in terms of political mobilization. I don't actually think that it is a fundamental flaw in the sense that it's not something that Nigerians can't overcome. I think it just created a difficult beginning. And of course, the Civil War coming out in part from that, from those divisions within society. I think the thing I'm more concerned about now at this point is the dampening effect that different identities across Nigeria have on larger scale political mobilization. And the other thing too being that oftentimes political elites resort to playing the ethnic card or the religious card so regularly in terms of their own political fortunes. And I think that constantly creates a dynamic where Nigerians are often in this sort of ethnic and religious bean counting perspective. How many of X group or ex-religion are in the cabinet, are in, our governors, et cetera, rather than getting down to the fundamental issue in I think, Nigerian development and society, which is poverty and dealing with the economic crisis that Nigerians have been struggling with for decades in many ways, shapes, and forms. And I think, in that economic crisis, and we can talk about this, of course, are the terrible impacts of the so-called Dutch disease, right? The over-reliance on one major export, and that, of course, is oil. And many of us, of course, have heard the phrase of the oil curse. And I think Nigerians in particular, when you throw together the toxic mix of authoritarian government after several decades of military rule, prior, of course, decades of colonial rule, but you throw together authoritarian government with extremely centralized resource like oil, and you create the toxic corruption environment that Nigerians are still struggling with. And those corruption patterns really are in so many ways, I think, the enemy of the natural power that I think Nigeria has and its rightful place as a leader in this world. But because it is so focused on internal struggles, I think that continues the process you're talking about.
Now, isn't part of the problem that we've always defined this problem within the framing of politics, so the multi-ethnic, multi-religious, but we have many other countries around the world that are so, diverse, but they've found a path. They found a path to economic prosperity. And once they hit that economic prosperity, many of the political issues tend to diminish, even if they don't disappear completely. So my thesis, or something I'm kind of thinking about, is that if we reframed Nigeria's problems around economic more than political, that could begin to help us solve many of these challenges, because then we would hold, instead of having these discussions around how many of my people, how many of my tribesmen or co-religionists are in government, we'll be focused on which of the presidents, which of the governors, which of the local government chairmen has actually advanced the people. And that in just it's a shifting of the framing could unlock what we're dealing with. What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, I think, and I think you put your finger on sort of the holy grail of Nigerian politics, which is the question of when does Nigerian politics move from being dominated by ethnicity to being dominated by class, which is the real difference, the real divide across the nation, is when will there be a real sort of pro-poor, pro-development political movement that will rise. And that, I think, has been the main enemy of that movement has been the sort of ethnic divides that keep coming up across the country. And I think what's interesting, however, though, at least in my mind, and this is something I've written quite a bit about, is that if you actually, when you interview political elites across Nigeria, it doesn't matter sort of where they are, where they're from Borno to Kano to Lagos to Anambra. The rich in Nigeria have far more in common with each other than they have to do with their own constituents.
Exactly.
So the political elites send their families all shop in London and Paris, and they send their kids to school here in the United States or in Europe. And where do they go for hospital stays? Of course, they all end up in Europe or the United States somewhere. And they live the fabulous life together, but more fundamentally, their values are very, very similar, which is interesting at the political level because you find this sort of interesting esprit de corps among legislators, among political elites, even though they fight, in a verbal sense, and there's a lot of brinkmanship among these various political elites. But at the end of the day, they come together and they settle each other, right? And they find ways to work around their problems because Nigeria over, the last 60 years has developed a political culture. And there is at the elite level a deep culture of negotiation and bargaining. Now, the flip side of negotiation and bargaining is corruption, and we can talk about that. But it provides an incredible glue that holds the country together in ways that are not apparent to many outsiders. So I think so long as we have this kind of quiet consensus among the political elite to sort of keep the status quo, which they are benefiting from tremendously, and not really focusing on a deeply grassroots development policy that really tries to enrich Nigerians, and in doing so, enrich the entire nation. This is the mind-boggling thing, of course, is that those elites would be fabulously more rich if they actually developed the country.
Exactly.
But it's been this long-standing approach to politics of short-term gain over any sort of long-term investment. And I think if Nigeria can move in that direction, then it would be a very, very different country. And we can talk about some of those steps of moving in that direction.
And we will get to those. We will get to corruption. We'll get to those steps. But just to stay with security and conflict for a little bit more, if we look at Nigeria's security architecture, from your study of this, from your review of various attempts we've made, what are some of the structural or policy changes that we need to bring to bear to see if we can build a security architecture that begins to address some of the conflict issues we're facing?
Yeah, I mean, on the security side, I think, the long-standing debate about localized political police forces is an essential piece of this. When we're in a situation where the Nigerian military is deployed in 33 to 36 of the states of the Federation, that is just not a sustainable model, even though, of course, that's been the model for a long time. But just to say that's a true sign that the fundamental issues of security are just not being addressed, and the Nigerian military itself is just simply not strong enough to be able to put out all of these fires at once all across the Federation. No military could manage that many challenges at once, and nor is the military is the bluntest instrument in your tool chest. It's you're using a sledgehammer to go after to go after bugs on the floor, and it's just it's not going to it's not going to improve things in a long-term sense. You really need to have a micro policing approach that deals with security problems immediately at the source. So many of security problems that we're looking at across Nigeria started with simple local divisions, and more fundamentally, particularly impoverished, particularly younger men who are disengaged from the economy and who do not have a sense of hope, and more so than that, are pushed often into these sorts of more violent groups because of the injustices that they face in their own local world. Which brings us to not simply just the police force, but of course the judiciary, and the failure of the Nigerian judicial system to provide simple justice solutions for everyday Nigerians in their everyday neighborhood life. How many of you in Nigeria, turn to the courts to solve the disputes that you face in your daily life when it comes to anything from divorce to a contract problem? You have to have a lot of money, and even then, there are all sorts of problems in the legal system, and I would throw the bar and lawyers into this mix that make the situation difficult. There are a lot of solutions that local government and state government can take to try to deal with this problem in terms of local mediation systems, creating local police forces, creating local investigation units that deal with issues of corruptions in the police force, and then, of course, There are civil society dimensions of this that we can talk about. And I want to, of course, acknowledge that the constitutional problems that Nigeria faces in terms of a localized police force. I think this is something that Nigerians across the country are ready to see a shift, because you see these vigilante groups that the different governors have been setting up are nothing more than gubernatorial efforts to try to set up a local police force, essentially.
You just took that question off my chart, because we've seen so many state governors set up these vigilante groups and make the argument that they want police forces. But we know from the way they've handled the vigilante groups that you can't really equip these incumbent governors with the law setting up police forces. However, another angle to that is, are we not going to be multiplying the problems we have with the Nigeria police force if we allow the different states to set up their own institutions, when we haven't been able to solve many of the challenges that that the Nigeria police force faces today? Challenges with capacity, challenges with just welfare of the police force, training, just rules of engagement. If we allow the different states to set up their police forces, are we just not multiplying the problem across board?
Yes, in one dimension that's true. I think in terms of looking at this through a path of marginal progress, I think that the costs of that outweigh the costs of the current system, which is clearly just not serving anyone. I think maybe one thing I want to mention as an overarching framework for thinking about all of these issues we're talking about is that, and this is something in my research I've written quite a bit about, is that the basis of all democratic systems around the world. You've heard the phrase, of course, in sort of American political conversation, checks and balances, right? About how, legislatures are supposed to balance the executive, and executive, also balanced by the judiciary. But I actually argue that that's based on a more deeper balance, which is a balance of power. And that advanced democratic systems feature a thick set of power balances, not only within government, but between government and society. So part of that balance of power is the role of the public, the role of civil society, the role of the media in playing these sorts of power balancing roles, businesses too. And in the same sense with the police force, if you have just a single police force, there's no check and balance on that police force. What happened in the American model over a long period of time, I mean, the United States was a deeply corrupt place in the 1800s. I mean, some would argue, of course, that there are, and I would agree, there are ongoing corruption patterns in the United States now. But what makes it different is that you have multiple levels of policing units that are not only policing the public, but they are policing each other. So you have federal police that are investigating state police, who are investigating local police. And local police, when you have corrupt state cops or corrupt federal cops, have other institutions in government that they can turn to and they can take their cases to, so that those actors are checked and balanced. You have a vibrant media that is just looking for a good story of corruption across the country and is ready to blow the whistle and get the cameras rolling on a corrupt cop somewhere, in one part of the country or another. So these sorts of thick checks and balances an important part of this. And the over-centralization of the system in Nigeria, especially in the hands of the executive. And, this goes beyond the police force. And we can talk about this more in a second. But in the case of the police, when you centralize it all in one structure, it means that there is no real viable force that is investigating the police. And, let's throw the legislatures into this. The legislatures are supposed to be doing their job, reviewing the impact of this and putting funds towards this effort. And, if you look at it, the Nigerian police force could actually do with a lot more money, especially if you were to break it into many, many different forces. Well, actually, I wouldn't say don't break the Nigerian police force. Just turn that institution into essentially the federal police, which is what it is. And then let the states and let the local governments begin to hire their own police forces.
And in your discussion of this balance of powers, what comes to mind is the role that civil society can play. And I know that's an area that you've done a lot of work in, but I'm going to pack that for a minute just to talk a bit about conflict resolution, right? At the root of several of these violent conflicts we have in Nigeria are many unresolved issues. And this is an area that you've done a lot of work in. So my question is, how should we approach conflict resolution in a country that is so low on trust, high on sectoral grievances, too many fractured lines that kind of separate us? What are some of the principles that you teach your students, for instance, on how to employ conflict resolution in a situation such as Nigeria?
Yeah, I think conflict resolution is at its best at the hyper-local level. Conflict resolution processes are very relationship-based, and they involve bringing 2, 3, 4, 15, 20 people together into a room, depending on the sort of approach you're talking about, mediation, facilitation, and so on. So we do have large group processes that can work with 500, 1,000 people at a time. And we can talk about those if that's of interest. But generally speaking, most processes are very hyper-local. So I think in the Nigerian case, and with a lot of my Nigerian partners, and let's first of all, let's shout out to the many different conflict resolution NGOs and initiatives across Nigeria that are doing really impressive work in trying to bridge a lot of these divides. But, all of these groups try to engage people at the local level, and I think, and also inculcate the skill set of these kinds of mediation processes, negotiation processes, which are an important part of a democratic political culture. So conflict resolution groups are essentially spreading democratic culture with the work that they do. So I think the sort of hyper-local dimension to this is an important part of this, though, of course, these groups can also work with, state level actors, with federal level actors, and they should indeed provide that kind of skill set.
So, I mean, if you look at Nigeria, for instance, one big elephant in the room is the Nigeria-Biafra Civil War. So yes, it ended, 5 decades ago, but it keeps rearing its ugly head. Certain groups of people in the country do not trust themselves because of, things that preceded even before I was born, and many of the pains that that went through that war and continues today. How would a government that really wants to put that episode to bed, engage it in a way that it doesn't trigger more conflict? So if you look at, say, the military rule, at the end of the military administrations, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Say whatever you may about it, it allowed Nigerians to vent, and we could kind of put an end to that pain, so to speak. We haven't done that like anything like that with the Biafran War. If we were to deal with it today, how do we safely deal with such an issue so that it doesn't trigger new conflicts?
Yeah, and thank you for this, because I think it builds on the first question in many ways, is that even though I've said, there's a strong local dimension to conflict resolution, there are a lot of things that can be done at the national level and the state level to deal with conflicts. And I think, sort of the impacts of Nigeria's civil war, as you say, are, I think, a fundamental issue that is still present today. And the way nations around the world deal with this, and the United Nations, has a deep skill set in setting up these kinds of commissions, is some kind of reconciliation commission. Now, as you said, there was one after the military period. And then also, there have been several efforts in the National Assembly to hold, a national conference in some way, shape, or form. Those are different vehicles that are looking at, renegotiating the shape of the federation. But a reconciliation commission is meant to be an honest conversation in a national way, understanding that, all of the scars of a terrible experience like a civil war can never be fully healed. But we're really thinking in terms of these sort of political cultural patterns that we were talking about earlier, in terms of trying to create a culture that says, two things. One is that that acknowledges the suffering that happened on all sides. But then second, also creates a sense of belonging, to say that, you suffered, we suffered. There were different political issues at play in that conversation, but we're all still part of this one large community. And the commission is meant to come up with recommendations to say, okay, how do we try to move beyond the scars of the Civil War? How do we make the Southeast not feel like it's perpetually left out of the fruits of the Federation? How do we not make the North and the Southwest somehow feel that in responding to those concerns, that their concerns are not being neglected either? And having some kind of a conversation that just, first of all, acknowledges what happened in the past, says that, look, it's been over 50 years since the end of the Civil War, and we're still struggling with these problems. What can be done to try to address and try to balance the scales a little bit? And you hear me using that word balance, is that, when things feel so out of balance, it's natural that people start to look for extra systemic solutions to their problems. Nigeria's great author, Chinua Achebe, when he was alive, actually proposed a commission to look at the post-Civil War impacts, particularly on the Southeast, but really to see how this has impacted the cohesiveness of the Federation. And so a commission like this could, for instance, begin to think about, well, we need data on, what are standards of living looking like in the Southeast as compared to the Southwest and the North? What sort of legal barriers are in place keeping people from the Southeast and other parts of the Federation to try to move up the ladder? And inevitably issues of, the complete lack of effective local governance will begin to pop, not as an Igbo issue, but as a Nigerian issue, and so all of these things can begin to come through there. And this makes, it makes, I know I'm making it sound like it's going to be a very clean and easy process, but it's a very messy process. There's going to be anger that's going to be vented, but that venting of that anger is exactly what you want in a cooperative, constructive process. Could be very helpful in many ways. And based on that, there could be other regions of Nigeria that could follow suit. Obviously, the Northeast, the Northwest, are both places that are feeling this. Exactly. We could go down the list.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, so another area that you do a lot of work in is civil society organizations. When we talked about the checks and balances or the balancing of powers, I don't see how the elite will, on their own, focus on driving progress for the masses, unless there's a countervailing force that pushes them in that direction. Or as maybe Stefan Decken has said, maybe there's an elite split for whatever political calculations, etc. But I think that civil society organizations should be the ones playing that role. But if we look at least from where I stand, the activities of civil society organizations today, compared to, for instance, when we were fighting for democracy, it appears that they've gone a bit quiet. What's your read on the current status of civil society organizations in Nigeria and how they can be further empowered to play that role of holding all sides to account?
Yeah, thank you for that. One way to sort of restate where we started the conversation at the beginning about the imposed state is that Nigerians never really have had a chance to build the social contract. Mm-hmm. And the social contract is defined as, the government gets to have power in exchange for looking after the interests of the public. Yeah. And Nigerians have a situation where the government has the power, but it's not looking after the interests of the public because of that disconnected nature between government and people. And so, building up that social contract, civil society is a critical force in doing that. But I would want to start by sort of, again, hearkening back to the first point about the security crisis in Nigeria, is that And I think one of the reasons we see differences between today's civil society in Nigeria and maybe, the really vibrant effects we saw in the 70s, 80s, and 90s at that time is without basic security in the states, it's extremely hard for civil society to function in a war zone. And, when you have such widespread kidnapping, you have so much criminality at play, it's extremely hard for NGOs, for civil society groups, religious institutions, you name it, all of the sort of cornucopia of civil society groups to function. So I think that explains in part some of the dampening effect that we're seeing. I think, though, also, too, we're seeing just a changing nature of the way that people organize worldwide, of course, because of the impact of information technology. So in some ways, the lack of information technology in the past was a hindrance to organization, but the presence, ever-present nature of our phones provides a host of new tools for governments to keep track of civil society, to harass civil society, and to sort of to put them down. And but it also atomizes the public in a way too, that makes things a little bit more difficult. That said, we've seen the rise of more sort of spontaneous, flash civil society, so to speak, moments across Nigeria, the various hashtag movements and so on, where people fill the streets over a particular issue, over a particular anger that's going on. So I think the nature of it has also shifted from formal organizations like we saw in the past, which would organize things and would bring people into the streets, to a more informal, disparate source of organization that's happening at the same time, where a lot of civil society groups are not able to function as much as they were. And I think another piece of this too is civil society has to be funded. And increasingly, much of the funding comes from the Nigerian state for many actors. The civil society groups that are fortunate enough to be able to get international funding are able to take a more independent path. But as you know, that international funding goes up and down, and not every civil society actor is able to go after it. Typically, the Abuja-based, Lagos-based, Kano-based civil society groups are able to capture those. And the vast majority of civil society groups across the federation really have to turn to state and local funds. And the state and local funders expect their civil society groups to get funded to play the tune that they wish, and it's very difficult for civil society to get out of that. And that gets a little bit into some of the problems with the overpowered state governor systems too. That we can get into that conversation as well.
Excellent. And I mean, just if you again think about civil society in the past, before the advent of or the ubiquity of telephones, it appears to me that civil society leaders then had to work a bit more to convince people to come out on the streets and drive change. But now that we've got phones in our hands, it appears that once you put out a tweet, you feel like you've done your bit and you go home. So whilst the phones could have been a tool to help build and mobilize people, it seems to give us this pseudo satisfaction that we've done some level of activism because we posted or tweeted something, but we really haven't done much of that work. Am I reading it right or no?
That's certainly a very important part of this. And you keep hearing me use the word again and again, culture, is that, culture shifts over time. And, and by culture, I'm not, in this case, I'm not referring to Igbo, Hausa, American, Russian, etc. I'm talking really about sort of political, social, organizational culture. What are your expectations as a member of society? And in the past, Nigeria had a really strong culture of social organization and social movement development. And and when young people, middle-aged people, old people, when they were upset about something, they just knew, because the culture was, what do you do when you're upset? Well, you get organized, you join a movement, you fill the streets, etc. Now, because of our largely sort of phone and internet-based world, people have different expectations. If you're a young person and you're angry, you don't know exactly where to turn. I mean, like you said, you can tweet something, or you can post something, or you can text your friends. or you can, you can Snapchat or Instagram something to folks. And, and to some extent, that dampens the urge to go fill the streets, but also it means that, you're not exactly sure where to turn. But I mean, I would also add too, I mean, the cost of filling the streets. I mean, the Nigerian government's response in recent years has been increasingly brutal to those kinds of street actions. And so for your average young person sort of weighing the cost benefit, it's not a surprise that, and I'm not just talking about young people, I mean, anybody, I'm not surprised any Nigerian doesn't say, look, maybe it's better I stay home because it's dangerous.
Exactly, exactly. Let's switch a little bit to democracy, which is another area that you've done some work. If we look at some of the Afrobarometer data on democracy, they're a bit scary. The younger ones, especially those who did not grow up under military rule, tend to fantasize about military rule, and as they see some successful coup d'etats, especially in our neighborhood, they seem to think that since democracy dividend has just trickled in while suffering has been a deluge, that maybe military rule would be a better answer to the challenges we face. What's your best argument for democracy, especially given that you've monitored elections in Nigeria, at least the last 7, and you've seen the ugly underside of elections? What's the argument, your best argument for a young person who thinks that democracy has lost its shine?
I think the best argument is looking at the record of the alternatives out there. If you look at the record of authoritarian governments all across the continent, there are a few, the best examples are Cote d'Ivoire and Rwanda. But there is not a single successful authoritarian developmental model in Africa. Rwanda is the only one that's sort of counting at this point, but the big problem that Rwanda faces, which is what Cote d'Ivoire faced, is that what happens when the old man, hands off power or steps down? In every one of these cases on the African continent so far, we see that at that time of transition, the country unravels. And I'm not sort of predicting doom for Rwanda. I hope that Rwanda does find a way out. But just to say that when you look at the unique diversity we were talking about in Nigeria and all across the continent, what's the first question that anybody's going to ask about a military ruler at top is, well, what group do they come from? And the presumption is immediately going to be, oh, well, if this is an Igbo military leader that comes to office, who are they going to, or that not comes to office, but comes to power in a coup? Who are they going to take care of? Who are they going to favor? And of course, anybody who's not from the ethnic group of the military leader in question is immediately going to presume, without with good cause, that government is not going to take care of its interests, and you're going to see immediately a mobilization along militaristic lines to try to counter that force. And there is the spiral that we saw in the Civil War in Nigeria, and we've seen all across the continent. So it's extremely unlikely that a military government is going to take better care. And the second thing that gets into democracy is that another way to think about democracy is that it is a vast learning instrument. Societies learn politically over time, just as individuals learn. And it takes a while for systems to learn how to manage themselves. And as difficult as the last 26 years of democracy in Nigeria have been, there has been political learning in the system. As I mentioned early on, the political elite, even though they are all sort of in this silent, cahoots over sort of the corruption model, at the same time have managed to hold the country together and to continue to move the country, not forward in a development sense, but to continue to sort of keep it at least in some sense of status quo. The next step has to be the development of some sort of counterbalancing power force within Nigeria that can check and balance the sitting government. And the one force all across Africa where you see African countries breaking out of the poverty of the past is the rise of a viable political opposition. And by that, I mean a viable, loyal political opposition, a coalition of political parties or a single political party. It depends on where you are. But some sort of opposition political force that reaches down to civil society. And there's that social contract we were talking about that reaches down to civil society and the public and says, look, put us in office and we will do better than the current government. And what is the first thing that political opposition needs is it needs better elections. And the only time in Nigeria where you've seen, fairly good election outcomes, and I don't mean to suggest they were perfect, but, the 2015 election, for instance, were periods where the political opposition was strong enough to check and balance the power of the sitting government and pushed hard for more credible elections than we'd seen in the past that led to a turnover in government. Now, that doesn't mean that when the opposition sweeps into office, suddenly everything's going to be chocolate and roses. But it means that in that alternation over time between in government and out of government, increasingly those political elites begin to have to build more and more alliances with civil society and with their constituents. And that over time begins to force them to have to provide better political governance. They begin with sort of, we'll build a school here or we'll build a road there. But over time, it leads to you can't sort of settle everybody in your constituency. Eventually, public policy essentially is an effort of political elites to sort of dash everyone, as many people as possible in their constituencies. And over time, that becomes more regularized, but it takes time for that to happen. So that's why I would say to young Nigerian people, I know this is always sort of what the old man says, but you need to have patience. But I would also say, don't simply sit home and be patient. I would say get organized. Continue to organize these extensive networks of supporters for change and keep pushing, and over time, and build those alliances with the political elites that are willing to talk to you.
So I mean, it sounds theoretically good, but our reality tells us otherwise, right? So if you look at what's happened since 2015, PDP should have been that strong opposition party, but PDP just basically vanished. They couldn't throw a punch. They've, pretty much disappeared as a political party. The Labour movement or the Labour Party had a bit of a showing at the last elections, but today it appears that, it's just Peter B who's carrying that mantra. And even people who won under the Labour Party banner have now switched over to APC. A lot of the politicians who were in different parties are now fighting for the APC tickets in their states to fight against whomever the incumbent is, especially where the APC is not in control. So if I'm a young person, just looking at the Nigerian political system, what I see is a one-party state. What I see is a state where the government controls pretty much all the levers of life. So for you to earn money in Nigeria, you must have some kind of a plug-in to government, except for some of the very few green shoots that we're seeing in Lagos in the tech space, or maybe entertainment. Every other person is looking for some linkage to government. So if a young person looks at this, where do they find the hope? Where do they find hope to continue to engage, to hope that the opposition can come together and at least, if not even take power, hold the incumbents accountable? What do I say to them?
Yeah, well, I guess I would spin 2023 a little bit differently in the sense that look at how close the opposition came to unseating the ruling APC. And if you just add together the vote counts for Obi and Atiku together, that if had either one of them backed the other, we would have had a very different election outcome, and we'd be in a very different circumstance at the moment in terms of leadership in Abuja. So actually in many ways, 2023 was a real sign that that this kind of political opposition organization can get really close to the top. I mean, and even in that circumstance, the opposition came really, really close to getting control of the House. The Senate, less so. And so I was watching those House, numbers very, very closely, and had all of political opposition come together. Now that's extremely difficult in any society. So I'm not saying that's a simple thing, but just to say that those numbers were pretty close. So for a young person, I would still come back to saying, look, the entry point for resistance is the local level. Is start wherever you are. What sort of form of social organization is available to you that you can turn to, and you can start sort of looking towards finding allies and getting organized. NGOs are often the ones we think about, but actually civil society, the big civil society organizations are religious institutions, trade unions, professional associations like the bar, doctors associations, so on. Depending on wherever you are, whatever you're connected to, I would start there. And I think I would throw into this mix, and we haven't talked about them yet, sort of the fourth tier of government, so to speak, the neighborhood associations and community associations. In my mind, it is the very bottom of the pyramid. It is the one form of governance in Nigeria that is really responsive to Nigerian needs. And of course, they vary widely all across the federation, depending where you are. But in many neighborhoods, you have some very, very effective neighborhood associations that where individuals, where you and five of your friends can show up and can have a real impact on the direction of the conversation locally. I would try to, within those areas, connect as much as possible, and then use the magic of the internet and your cell phone to find allies in other parts of the local government and the state and the federation over time. But think in terms of the long game. Start building relationships with politicians early on. Follow them up through their careers so that in 5 years, 7 years, when they've moved up the ladder, you have that relationship and they feel that connection to you. Try to think about the long game, and then, but be organized and be prepared so that if you have a situation where, if we see like in 23, so let's say, dare I say, hell freezes over and Peter Obi and former Vice President Atiku actually come to some sort of an agreement between the two of them, and an opportunity for real change hits, then I would go for that. I'd also say, look at the state level. There are states where there are a little bit more balance at play, where local action can have an impact.
And, very quickly, soon I'm going to open it up for audience participation. I'm going to invite you to please type your questions in the Q&A tab, and I will attribute the questions to whomever it came from. And we'll also begin to bring this whole thing together. The theme of our conversation today is charting a path to peace for Nigeria. And, I'd like, Darren, if you can, to kind of lay out the core levers, the core drivers, from taking Nigeria from where we are today, where there's just a lot of violent conflict across the country, unsettled or unresolved historical grievances, to a Nigeria, where peace reigns, where we can bequeath that banner without stain to the younger generation. What are the different elements? So if there was a government, a president, a group of leaders, who really want to do this work, what are some of the things they need to pay attention to?
Well, I think, where you just ended is really the big question. I've always felt like if you actually have a reformist group in government, they could turn Nigeria around within 10 years. With leadership from the top, I think that Nigeria is definitely in a really important position if they were able to move things forward. And I'd like to see more of that. And I'm not just pointing the finger at the Tinubu administration. I would throw the governors very much into this mix, is that this is a system-wide concern is comprehensive reform at that level. And like we've been talking about as well, I mean, I think I'd like to see a much more aggressive sort of civil society activity from the bottom up. But let's start at the top in terms of, first and foremost, a comprehensive effort to deal with the security crisis. And I think that, a big part of that, and I know people are very afraid of coups across the continent, but corruption within the military is a really it's a massive problem. It's something that that has to be dealt with through external investigation agencies. The military has to be treated like any other bureaucracy, and understand that there's a tremendous amount of money going through the military. But look, let's not blame the military as well in this. I mean, the legislatures have their hands in the till, local government actors. So it really means that the presidency is going to have to construct several different insulated anti-corruption agencies, or reform key anti-corruption agencies with real professionals that are paid well enough to do their job, to go after corruption beginning with these critical institutions like the military. We talked about some of the things that have to be done with the police as well. I think that sort of comprehensive security reform is an essential piece of this. And I know if President Tinubu and his administration were to go after this, it would put them in a very vulnerable position. But I think it's the necessary position that leadership would have to go for. Second is, I think that the federal government has to finally deal with the authoritarian structures at the state level. In other words, the imperial governorships that we have all across the nation, with governors who just have their hands on everything, control of all of the finances, and therefore sort of rule their states in that fashion. I think, to the Buhari administration, deserves some credit on this. And I think the Tinubu administration has been trying to do this as well, to try to empower those local governments. I think President Tinubu has got those funds to local governments, like Buhari was not able to do. But, you can't stop there. You really have to empower those local units to be able to start to deal with these problems locally. And then, as I said, this impetus from outside, I would really like to see the political opposition get its act together. All of this sort of constant infighting, PDP, LP, all of the different sort of labels that are out there. There is sufficient political opposition infrastructure out there if those politicians could get it together. I think, this is where the big political elites really bear the most responsibility. And the sooner that they can get together a united front, the sooner that they can say, look, we provide Nigerians an alternative, the sooner it will unlock that energy of frustration on the ground, that will provide, that tremendous force to try to really begin to change things.
One point we haven't quite kind of unpacked a bit is economic development, as a path to stability, as a path to peace. What are some of your thoughts on this, as someone who's observed Nigeria quite closely for a couple of decades now? What are some of the things we've done right? What are some of the things we should be doing differently, or we should deepen our efforts with?
Yeah, and I go back and forth. I mean, I understand the Tinubu administration's embrace of shock therapy with the Nigerian economy. Certainly sort of the petroleum subsidies was a big problem for long-term economic stability, and the fluctuations in the currency were both massive problems. But shock therapy really only worked in Eastern Europe because you had, the overwhelming role of the European Union ready there to try to foot the bill for a lot of these very difficult transitions that happened from communism to capitalism. It's not that the Nigerian economy is in that same sort of role, but these kind of shock therapy efforts, without some sort of real cushioning for the broader public, means that the poorest of the poor are footing the bill for previous Nigerian governmental irresponsibility. And I think that maybe a slower transition to those kinds of sort of basic market designs are important. The other two things that I think are boggle my mind as much as any other sort of observer of Nigerian politics is the inability to get the basic economic structures in place. And by this, I mean really thinking about electricity and roads. Both of those are something that the Nigerian system could solve if it wanted to. I'm not saying that they're simple, but they are problems that are solvable. And the fact that they haven't been solved means that the people that are benefiting from the current system have been successful in stopping any sort of reforms. If you get the roads together, you get the power together, this natural Nigerian entrepreneurial support, effort would, I think, just be unleashed. I mean, I think also the banking sector in terms of providing, some sort of basic credit for small and medium enterprises in a way that is sustainable. But again, those three things are not something that are impossible for a system like Nigeria. If you get those basics right, I think the natural power of Nigeria would just be unlocked, provided you are able to provide some of that basic sort of governance stability that we've been talking about all along. I think there's still a tremendous effort and opportunity in Lagos. That if the federal government were allowed to create sort of more of an enabling environment there, we would see the impacts of that begin to spread across the federation, as long as we could break those monopolies of the governors within their states, and that's going to take some time.
And I know President Tinubu, gets a lot of flack on, his approach with, just removing the band-aid, just pulling the band-aid off, especially with the fuel subsidy, etc. But didn't he demonstrate a deep understanding of Nigerian politics with that? That if he tried to do it any other way, the entrenched interests would have found a way to circumvent it, and that maybe that was just the only way to do it. I mean, every president from Obasanjo in 77, when we introduced fuel subsidy, have been saying, okay, we're going to cut it, but none of them could do it because these are real entrenched interests, and what he did was to say, you know what, if we're going to do this, we got to do it. It'll be painful. I'll take a risk with my government, but it's the right thing to do. Shouldn't we be giving him kudos for that?
I think he definitely deserves kudos for bold leadership on that point. And certainly he's shown a willingness to take the heat for some very unpopular policies. So there's no doubt about that. And it's easy for me sitting in San Diego to kind of second guess, these very difficult policy decisions. So that's all, I think, correct. I think if I were in his shoes, I think I would have maybe taken a year before I ripped the Band-Aid off. And I would have tried to set certain sort of policy structures in place without signaling that I was going to rip the Band-Aid off necessarily, so as, not to, because then the speculation would go, through the roof, as you mentioned, but rather begin to set some pro-poor policies in place, that would begin to make sure that there were some kind of better cushion so that when I ripped the Band-Aid off, it made sense to Nigerians and would at least have a better possibility for that. And again, I think the security picture is an important part of this. We've ripped the Band-Aid off at a very moment when, Nigerians have a gun at their head in their localities, and their ability to do something about improving their livelihoods is extremely undermined by that. So I think I would have wanted to get I think I would have chosen the security problem first, and along with a pro-poor, wide-based economic development policy, and then rip the Band-Aid off.
Yeah, fair point. I have a comment, I guess, from Professor Richard Joseph, who's been a guest on this podcast, and who recently donated almost 5,000 books to the Nigeria International Institute of International Affairs for the Professor Richard Joseph Library there, and we're very grateful for that. His comment is no mention of Nigeria in the Donald Trump era, space vacated for Nigerian policy. So I mean that brings this big question to the fore. Where does Nigeria stand in this Trump era, where Trump seems to, we've seen what he's done with USAID, but his America first means almost America isolationism. What does that mean for Nigeria as a country? What does that mean for Nigeria as a leader within the African space?
Thank you for that, and thank you to Richard Joseph. I mean, a great mentor and leader in our field. I'm grateful that he's tuned in. I think we didn't get to that, and I think it really underscores the difficulty of civil society we were talking about earlier. Is that, I mean, USAID was not sort of the largest donor in the mix, but certainly a very large donor in Nigeria, and also giving a great deal of money to global democracy support organizations like the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, a lot of organizations that have been really important partners, organizations supporting Nigerian labor organizations and networking. So all of those have been impacted by this, and we're going to see at least a period here where there's a lot less funds and support for civil society, and that's going to sap the strength of civil society further. There's no doubt about it. I don't think, given what's happening with Russia and Ukraine in Eastern Europe, whether the Europeans are going to be able to step into that gap in terms of providing more assistance for Nigerian civil society than they already do. China is not showing much interest in supporting civil society anywhere in the world, much less in China itself. So I do think that that's going to be a catastrophic impact on civil society actors. And I would hope, again, and we didn't really talk about this, about sort of Nigerian businesses looking to provide increasing sort of charitable support for civil society activity. There is not a deep tradition of that in Nigeria. I'd love to see more folks like Aliko Dangote, who has, put together a foundation, putting money together for a variety of projects around the country. I'd love to see more of those sorts of transformational-oriented business folks supporting civil society. But in terms of U.S. foreign policy, I mean, there's no doubt. Well, I think we have to put it in perspective. Is that Nigeria has not gotten a lot of attention. It tends to get more attention under the Democrats for sure. And in some ways, U.S. foreign policy has been pivotal at key moments in the elections. Certainly playing a role, for instance, in encouraging President Jonathan to hand over power to President Buhari in 2015. Those sorts of positive pressure, and exercise of American power in support of democracy, support for the Nigerian military in fighting Boko Haram and other actors. I think we're going to see quite a bit less of that, and Nigeria is going to be standing more and more on its own, except in terms of what sort of relationships it wants to build with China at this point. I do worry as an American. I worry about opportunities for Russian foreign policy in West Africa. The Russians have certainly played a pro-dictatorship role in the region. The American absence is going to, I think, exacerbate all these problems, and I think it sets a fire under people like myself and Professor Joseph to try to bring pressure in Washington to make sure American foreign policy, does not forget the most important actor in West Africa and indeed on the continent.
Excellent, excellent. I have a question from Chinelo Ugu. She's an analyst with us at Nextier. Would you say that the we versus them mentality contributes to the failure of the Nigerian police force to effectively deliver? If yes, what do you propose as a practical solution? So I guess this is really probably more around the capacity building, the training that goes, that the police get, and the welfare package, where the police really feels like no one's taking care of them, so they've got to take care of themselves. Or maybe also just the barracks mentality, it's us versus these civilians, So how do you unpack all of that? And, what are some ideas on how we move forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, community policing models, and there are many of these around the world, are a perfect fit for the Nigerian context, and this does get us back to local and state police forces, is that, if you have somebody who's from the region. Now, of course, there are corruption fears. This person's going to be embedded in local networks, that kind of thing. But I think, if anything, the Nigerian police have proven is that they are not insulated from corruption. So I think, those local ties, in many ways, really are an important insulating factor against corruption. And local community policing is built upon the entire notion of building relationships with local communities. Is that any police officer around the world that you talk to will tell you the first thing that they turn to when they have to do their job are local relationships. You need to talk to people in the community. You need to have these. And a community policing model is based upon this. And I want to give a shout out to the Clean Foundation in Abuja. Clean has done extensive work with the police all across Nigeria, also with the military, by the way. They have a host of models that work very, very well. And literally, you can take them off the shelf and you can input those. I think those are there's a lot of answers out there if Nigerian leaders show some leadership on this issue. I would also end on pointing back to what I said about the importance of counterbalancing agencies investigating each other. I think that the Nigerian police force needs to be regularly investigated. It's just like companies have to be regularly audited. It's just a part of the system. And over time, the police will, rather than being defensive about it in that us versus them mentality, will just see it as a part. It's just like going to see the doctor. You have to get that flu shot. And in the same way, the police needs to be audited on a regular basis, not because we see them as corrupt so-and-sos in the long run, but that they are such an important part, a fundamental building block of society. They need to be held to the highest standards. And there are ways to get to that through these sort of community policing models and these sort of reforms. Maybe I'll also throw in there at the end what we said earlier about the judiciary. The judiciary needs to be a clean partner for the police. And judges need to do their job, which means they need to be paid properly. They need to be regularly investigated for what they do, and they need to be given the resources available to do their job so that when police bring these cases, they're actually making decisions based on the merits of the case.
Exactly. And I have a question, comment on a question from Dozier Balobieri. He's joining from DC. So he's asking a DC type question. The countering Chinese influence has always been there, but how do we balance trying to address Russian influence in West Africa, Nigeria, vis-a-vis the seeming positive detente that the US government is having with Russia? It seems the US is ready to yield ground to Russia in the region or in this regard. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I think that, especially with sort of the increasingly cozy relationship between President Trump and President Putin, I'm very afraid that it's going to take some time before the Trump administration begins to realize that they're being bamboozled by Russia, in many, many different circumstances. And I think that, balancing out Russian influence is something that really comes back to Nigerian foreign policy. I would like to see the Nigerian foreign affairs apparatus taking a far more robust effort towards trying to build coalitions across West Africa. I mean, again, I think President Tinubu's bold threat against some of its West African military neighbors initially and then backing off was a sign, certainly, that I think President Tinubu is seized of the matter. I don't think that approach was necessarily the best one to take at the time, but I think it shows that Nigeria, if it builds some local coalitions with other countries in the region, and across Africa. I mean, South Africa has an interest in this in the situation in West Africa, even though it's far away. But in terms of the sort of domino effect across the continent, trying to build progressive anti-authoritarian, and in doing so, essentially sort of anti-Russian foreign policy, building that kind of containment strategy is something that's essential, and I'd like to see more of that. I mean, the fact that that Nigeria still has not sent a full ambassador corps around the world, I think shows that it's not that Nigerian foreign policy is not getting the support that it needs, and a robust regional initiative. I would love to see the foreign minister all across the region trying to work with counterparts and really trying to build up that kind of coalition that we're talking about.
Fantastic. And just to say that The Economist this week has a brilliant piece on how Putin is playing Donald Trump like a fiddle. Interesting piece for anyone who wants to check it out. There's a question here from Ndunwokolo, my partner at Nextier. He says, "Hi, Darren. Looking at the work you're doing with DemNet, Democracy Network, in 10 African countries, do you think that it's becoming clear that strong men corrupt democracies, looking at the case of President Trump?"
Yes, there's no doubt. Well, let's define the strong man. I mean, in the sense that, strong leaders are not a problem for democracy. And in fact, of course, we celebrate strong leaders. The difference between a strong leader and a strong man is the nature of their power base, right? And so when we have someone who builds a legitimate public coalition and works within the rules of the system to try to aggressively and forcefully move forward a policy agenda, that's leadership. When you have someone who builds that kind of a coalition and then tries to deconstruct the law and tries to circumvent constitutional provisions, then you have a strongman, and that is destructive for democracy. The key issue here is playing by the rules and working within the system. If you don't like the rules, there are vehicles for changing those, which are legislatures, which means you got to go through the system as it is. You got to do the hard work of convincing other parts of the system that your policy is the correct one. And even if you have people like me who voted on the other side and disagree, we all we can do is to oppose and to vote otherwise at the next election. Ruling parties get a chance to rule, but they have to do it within the system and by the rules. And so I think that is sort of the key issue here. That's from the United States, where we're seeing the Trump administration actively circumventing the law and pushing presidential powers far beyond the intents of the Constitution, undermining the strength of democracy, to Africa, where you have governors who are completely unbound by the law and are essentially ruling as semi-elected dictators in many of their states. That pattern needs to change, and that's where legislatures, that's where civil society, that's where political opposition comes in to try to rebuild and restore that balance. You don't get a strong leader without a strong coalition, without strong systems and strong rules.
So let's stay with the US for one more minute. What's your view on what Trump is doing to the institutions of democracy and just the institutions of rule-based world order, right? Do you think these institutions will hold up? Or do you think that the institutions were always overrated and that faced with this attack, that we'll find that the institutions were never that strong anyway?
Yeah, I think we're still in a phase where the institutions are strong enough to continue to push back to some extent. But that is what makes this current period extremely dangerous, is that the Trump administration is very actively flouting norms across the system that have been in place for a long time. Firing people in the FBI that were ordered by the previous administration to conduct investigations into the corrupt activities of Donald Trump, and who were ordered to do their job and investigate the people that took over the Capitol building on January 6th, and so on. Essentially, this witch hunt for political opponents within the system undermines the notion of a professional bureaucracy people who's just doing their job because that's what they're supposed to do, and replacing those with political loyalists is going to damage American political culture in a way that is going to take a while to try to restore. We would hope a lot's going to depend on who's going to succeed Donald Trump. What will the next president do? Will they continue this kind of neo-patrimonial, as Richard Joseph would say, pre-Bendel approach to politics, essentially? Although it's not quite based on ethnicity, though, frankly, there's a strong ethnic dimension.
Isn't it? It's based on tribes. It's based on tribes. So in Nigeria, you call it ethnic groups, but in America, there are tribes. There are tribes who believe in different values, and they're more connected to their value system than they are to the guy on the other side of the country. So it's pre-Bendelism as well.
Well, and a strong undertone of race in a lot of what's happening coming out of Washington. I mean, right now in American education, diversity programming is under heavy attack coming out of Washington. And there certainly diversity programs are not perfect, and there's a lot of room there for correction and reform. But the administration's approach to sort of burn the whole system down is really causing chaos throughout the system. It's going to undermine the effectiveness of academia to provide innovation to the American economy. And that in turn is going to have a broader impact on our role as a leading nation.
So I've got a question here from Chibike Mbahurike. Thank you, Prof. Please, any more insights on how Nigerians can engender a sense of shared citizenship and national identity despite ethnic and religious diversity and the tensions they generate? So this is back to some of the earlier conversations we had. Yeah.
Yes, in terms of sort of a shared identity, identity flows from social structures. Right. So, the great anthropologist Kevin Avruck talks about culture fills containers. And what are the containers? Those containers are social structures. So the importance of each social structure, the relevance that it has in your life, impacts what each level of culture is to you. So you're not only an ethnic culture, you also are a national culture, Nigerian. You also have an organizational culture. If you belong to trade unions, you have a state level structure, you have a local structure that you belong to. So you have many different levels of culture, all of us do, within ourselves. And so what matters is how those various levels of culture impact you in your daily life. How relevant are they? And so the more that any one of those containers are discriminated against, or the more that they become the central mechanism in your life. So if your ethnicity is the reason that you're not able to get a scholarship, that you're not able to get a job, that you're not able to have access to government funds, then that ethnic factor becomes all the more relevant in your identity. If we can change those sorts of barriers to identity within the system, and we can increase the relevance of other identities, your socioeconomic status, your trade, your profession. The more that those become important, the more that we can de-emphasize particularly religion and ethnicity, and the more we can begin to emphasize the Nigerian container. And the Nigerian container needs to produce for you. It needs to be useful for you. The more that the Nigerian state is only represented by that policeman at the corner demanding a bribe from you, then it is a hostile entity. But if that Nigerian state can actually provide you with basic goods, electricity, roads, small business loans, etc., like we've been talking about, the more that identity will take greater and greater relevance.
And I've got a question here from Umar Dare Baba. And, I think what he's driving at is that if we look at the Nigeria structure, the constitution, and the institutions, it appears that Nigeria's failure is more systemic than the individuals or the operators within the system. So it's more of a structural, systemic challenge. And his question is, what are your thoughts on this?
Which is the systemic challenge?
So I think what he's driving at is that the crisis we face in Nigeria is driven more by structural challenges than what the operator or the individual does within that structure. So if the structure is wrong, irrespective of what the people are trying to do, it's not going to work. And I guess his question is, do you agree with this? And then probably if I layer on it, how do we walk our way out of this, out of that mess, if he's right?
Yeah, I think, so we've talked about this question quite a bit, right? In terms of all the structures we've been talking about, in terms of the federal units, the state units, the police, anti-corruption, agencies, all of those different structures, need to be improved upon and get right. If by structure, if we're also just talking about simply about, the structure of Nigeria as a federation, for instance, I think that the federal system actually has been, in part, some of the saving grace of Nigeria is that it really has helped to decentralize these centrifugal forces within Nigeria, and it really helped to bring the state, sort of state impact closer and closer to the local level. But at this point, it really is only getting as far as the state capitals, and it hasn't really gotten down to the local levels. I think the greatest structural reform I would consider folks to think about would be engagement of this fourth tier of the neighborhood associations. I think that governance can do a lot to try to empower these units because they are the closest to the average Nigerian. They are a place where your bread and butter issues are really able to be addressed. And local governments could do a lot in terms of providing funds for neighborhood associations so that they can deal with these problems over time. So I think that's one sort of big structural reform that I think could have a lot of impact there. The other structural reform, again, I'll end on, is this sort of balance of power is, in empowering legislatures and judiciary to really check and balance executives at all levels.
So I like the idea of the community associations and how they could be the fourth tier of government, especially from the Southeast. Many of the developments you see in communities are run by the town unions, or the town unions convincing some of the illustrious members of the community to build roads, build schools, connect electricity to the national grid, etc. But I struggle with the idea you're pushing of getting the government to support these community associations, because I fear that, sadly, government's corrupting influence could just turn off the lights, in these associations that are really, in most instances, the only drivers of development in those communities. So getting them closer to the government could actually be introducing some virus to that system that would then, extinguish that little light that's still there.
No, I agree with you. That's a huge danger. I would say, this is where the beauty of federalism steps in, right? Is that different states could come to different conclusions to this problem, and we could see experimentation across the federation, and Nigerians can learn from each other as to what system seems to work best. I could foresee some states where the neighborhood association becomes a formal fourth tier and somehow has some sort of formal relationship to the LGA, local government structure. I could see other states where the neighborhood association essentially remains a civil society actor, a private local actor, but local governments just simply provide block grants, challenge grants, that sort of funding, okay, and works in partnership with these private entities. Governments around the world do that in many different ways already. And so that would retain some of the private dimension of it, but also have a public factor to it. There's no doubt, however, once money is on the table, there will be a corrupting influence. But I feel that that's already there in many ways. I mean, neighborhood associations, of course, the political parties, have these in their sights in terms of thinking about, building allies and that sort of thing. So, but what makes the community association, I think, far more far less corrupt in its potential is because it is so small. It is something where you and 10 of your neighbors can walk in and can have, an investigating influence and can say, where did the money go? And to try to sort of provide that direct impact. Now, that would have, that we would see there'd be instability, there'd be violence in some neighborhoods. I don't mean to suggest it would be all clean and simple, but I think that would be the learning path towards development of stronger institutions. And that's sort of the opening channel. That's the bottom step in the escalator that will help sort of bring governance up the chain. And if it is met by reformists at the top trying to push down, the governors can be kind of sandwiched in the middle. And I don't mean to blame everything on the governors. I think they're just the most blatant of these actors, but also other federal actors in the system can be sort of pushed from bottom and the top at the same time.
Mm-hmm. I have another question. I think maybe we have just enough time for this question from Chibike Mbahurike. Given the growing need for Nigeria to protect her national sovereignty, are there still some safe entry points for the international community to genuinely support Nigeria's peace-building efforts, especially when the threat is election-related?
Yes, I still think that there's a tremendous role that international actors. I mean, I still think, and I hope I'm wrong about the Trump foreign policy. I hope that the Trump actors, I mean, we're still only a month into this administration, and understandably, they've been primarily focused on domestic policy. So we haven't seen a good sense as to what the Trump administration West Africa policy is. And I hope I'm wrong about the retreat in the face of sort of Russian influence in the region, and that Washington sees the real threat there. And it could still provide, important financial assistance for democracy building in Nigeria. And it could work with European allies, with Japan, with India, with a lot of other really important global actors, and try to sort of support Nigerian reform efforts, and can gently nudge Nigeria's most powerful political elites when they veer off in the wrong direction, and can applaud and support when they head off in the direction that's in the interests of the vast majority of Nigerians, most of all. So there's still definitely room for that. If I'm correct about sort of the lack of American leadership in this way, I still think, there's a lot of possibility there for the Europeans certainly to take a more robust role in terms of trying to support clean elections in Nigeria. I do think India is beginning to sort of flex its muscles worldwide.
Yep.
It is the largest democracy. I would love to see European, Indian, Japanese coalitions on the continent trying to support progressive actors in reforming the system. So there's a lot of possibilities there. South Africa is still, a possibility in this. I mean, South Africa's got deep problems internally of its own, but it is still, certainly a very important democratic model on the continent. And, and of course, I'm very fond of Ghana and the democratic progress that has been made there. I think that Ghana continues to be an important regional leader that these global actors could work with in terms of trying to craft local policy solutions.
And hopefully someday when we have this conversation in the future, the discussion will be that Nigeria, would be a big player to help other African countries, et cetera, et cetera. But let me give to you the last 2 minutes. Maybe there's something you want to talk about that we haven't covered that you can use this time to just share with us.
Well, maybe I'll end with like your last point there. I mean, in terms of saying that I do really feel that leadership in Nigeria could turn Nigeria around in a 10-year time frame. But if we don't get it, I do think that, Nigerians themselves, I mean, I think this incredible entrepreneurial spirit all across the Federation will eventually make Nigeria succeed, maybe in a 40-year time frame, which, my young friends and colleagues are not going to be happy to hear that. So, the more that we can see strong civil society networking at the local level, particularly engaging with these community associations, is important. Maybe something we haven't talked about is the importance of religious institutions. Much of my work has been on Muslim-Christian dialogue. The one massive civil society sector that every Nigerian belongs to is religious institutions. These are extremely powerful actors. And of course, I wouldn't necessarily say that they're always progressive, but they certainly, all across the Federation, Muslim, Christian, traditional religion, you name it, I think there's a strong interest in progressive governance in terms of anti-corruption. This is something that I think all the religious institutions are deeply set against, and I think that's a unifying factor. I would really like to see increased interreligious dialogue. I would love to see organizations like NIREC and other sort of vast interreligious coalitions taking a more forceful role in setting the moral leadership on the issue of corruption, and helping to empower Nigerians to say, look, those bribes are not correct. They are not ethical, and that God is with the average Nigerian on this point.
Fantastic. Darren, thank you so much for this brilliant conversation on charting a path for Nigeria to peace. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks for all the great questions from folks.
And for everyone who joined us, thank you for joining. We'll be back to you next week with another topic, touring stability and development in Africa. And it's going to be on Wednesday, February 26th. And I hope that you can join us. Thank you so much and have a great evening.